Have you ever sat next to someone on a plane and never really looked at them? Not once. Only to find out somewhere over the clouds that they were carrying a story that would change the way you see everything. That's exactly what happened on Flight 1142, Dallas to Seattle. And the man at the center of it was sitting quietly in seat 12F, holding his sleeping daughter, hoping no one would bother him. Nobody did. That was rather the problem. The early morning flight smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air and someone's too sweet hand lotion. Gate B14 had been chaos, rolling suitcases, overhead announcements, a toddler shrieking somewhere near the Cinnabon. Finnegan Brooks moved through all of it without a word of complaint. His 7-year-old daughter Lila was balanced on his hip. Her little pink backpack bumped against his worn denim jacket with every step. He was 36, short brown hair, light stubble, work boots scuffed at the toe from 1,000 early mornings on a concrete garage floor. 6 feet tall, solidly built, but he carried himself with the particular humility of a man who had learned, over time, that taking up space makes other people uncomfortable, so he didn't. In 11D, a businessman in a crisp charcoal blazer exhaled loudly when Finnegan took 2 extra seconds to lift his bag into the overhead bin. The flight attendant offered the kind of smile that never quite reaches the eyes. The woman in 12E was already scrolling her phone before he'd even buckled in. Invisible. That was the word for it. Not disliked, just unseen. Lila curled into his chest the moment he sat down. Her curly blonde hair tickled his chin. She never let go of that backpack. Inside it, 2 crayons, a dog-eared picture book about horses, and a small plastic toy wrench she'd claimed from his toolbox 2 years ago and named Gerald. He had never corrected her on the name. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. He had saved for 3 years for this flight. 3 years of overtime. Of peanut butter sandwiches, packed so Lila could have the good lunch at school. Of sleeping on the pull-out sofa so she could have the bedroom. His sister in Washington had promised steady work at a garage near McCord Air Base. A new start. A real one. The seat across the aisle sat empty. It was the seat his wife used to take. She had been gone 3 years now. A car accident on a rain-slick Tuesday that had rearranged the entire shape of his life. He looked at that empty seat once. Just once. Then he looked away. Lila stirred, her voice small and soft against his collar. "Daddy, we're gonna be okay, right? I'm scared of flying." He didn't hesitate. Not for a single second. "We'll always be okay, sweetheart," he said. His thumb traced slow circles on her back. "As long as we stay kind to others. Even when they don't see it." She considered this with the grave seriousness only a 7-year-old can muster. "Even the man who huffed at you?" He almost smiled. "Especially him." She was quiet a moment. Then, very softly, "Mama used to say that too." He didn't trust himself to speak for a second or two. "She did," he finally said. "She was smarter than both of us." Lila nodded solemnly, tucked her chin against his chest, closed her eyes. He stared at the seat back in front of him. The ache was familiar by now. Not sharp the way it had been in the beginning, but steady. The way an old porch swing still creaks in the same spot it did 30 years ago. You know it's coming. You sit down anyway. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. Smooth, professional, routine. Cruising altitude, clear skies, possible military aircraft visible to the north, a training corridor. Lila's eyes went wide. "Daddy? Fighter jets?" Finnegan went very still. Not from fear. From something older. Something that had been quiet inside him for a long time. Because 10 years ago, Finnegan Brooks had not been a mechanic. He had not been invisible. He had stood on a runway in the gray pre-dawn dark, keeping the most advanced fighter jets in the world alive, one bolt at a time. His call sign had been Ghost, and somewhere above the clouds ahead of them, those jets were flying right now. He had no idea that one of those pilots already knew his name. Stay with us, because what happens in the next 20 minutes will remind you that the quietest people in the room are sometimes carrying the most extraordinary stories. If you walked past Finnegan at the airport, would you have noticed him or looked away? Drop a yes or no in the comments. Be honest. The plane leveled out above the clouds, and for a while, the world below simply ceased to exist. Lila dozed against his chest. The businessman in 11D had his laptop open. Blue light washing over a face that carried the particular blankness of someone who had stopped noticing other people entirely. The flight attendant moved down the aisle with her cart, handed Finnegan a coffee without making eye contact. He said thank you anyway. He always said thank you anyway. Out the oval window, the sky was impossibly blue, the kind that has no bottom to it, that goes on forever if you let your eyes follow it. Finnegan knew that sky, had spent years under it, responsible for it in ways the man in 11D would never understand. Out there in the training corridor, F-22 Raptors were climbing and banking in formations he could still picture from memory. The way a woman who has baked in the same kitchen for 40 years can picture exactly where the light falls on the counter at 7 in the morning. Every angle, every shadow, every familiar thing. He had tucked a photo of Carol's garage in his wallet, right behind Lila's school picture, the two most important destinations he was navigating toward, carried everywhere. Not glamorous, not the stuff of anyone's highlight reel, but real and forward-moving, and his. It was enough. He was just beginning to believe that again. 2 rows ahead, something broke. Not a loud sound, more like the kind that cuts through everything else. A child's sob, ragged and sudden, the way crying sounds when it's been held in too long and finally gives way all at once. A little boy, maybe 5 years old, pressed into the window seat of 10F, his whole small body shaking, hands clamped over his ears. A patch of turbulence had rattled the plane minutes earlier. The turbulence had passed. The boy had not. His name was Finn, his mother Greta, 30 years old, dark circles under her eyes, running on 3 hours of sleep and sheer willpower. She was crouched in the aisle beside him, one hand on his knee. "Baby, please, please look at me. It's just the plane. It's just noise, sweetheart." He couldn't hear her over whatever was happening inside his own head. Greta pressed her knuckles to her mouth. Around her, the cabin offered the particular uncomfortable silence of passengers who notice a problem and are quietly relieved it isn't theirs to solve. The woman in 10E had her headphones on. The man across the aisle had turned toward his window. Nobody moved. Today was supposed to be a good day. Greta was bringing Finn to see his father, Captain Raphael, an F-22 pilot. After 4 months apart, 4 months of video calls where her son pressed his face too close to the screen and asked, "Is Daddy inside the phone, Mama?" She had packed everything: snacks, cartoons loaded on the tablet, the stuffed elephant he couldn't sleep without. She had not planned for this. Finnegan was unbuckled before he'd made the conscious decision to move. Muscle memory. Maybe. The instinct of a man who spent years on flight lines where the rule was simple. You see a problem. You fix it. No calculating the inconvenience. No waiting for someone else. You just move. He crossed the 2 rows quietly and knelt in the aisle beside Greta. At the boy's eye level. The way you look at someone when you want them to know they are truly, actually being seen. "Hey there, buddy," he said. His voice was calm, steady, the same voice he'd used on runways at 2 in the morning, talking young crew members through their first engine procedure, with the confidence of a man who never let his own doubts show when someone needed him solid. "I used to fix the fastest planes in the world. Want to hear how I kept them safe?" Finn went still, just for a second. The way a child goes still when something unexpected is suddenly more interesting than what frightened them. Finnegan reached back without looking. Lila, awake now, watching her father with those wide, patient eyes, held out Gerald the toy wrench without a word. No hesitation. She had watched her father be this kind of person every single day, and she had simply assumed it was what people did. He held the wrench up. Finn stared at it. "This," Finnegan said, turning it slowly, as if it were the most important instrument in the aerospace industry, is how a ghost mechanic keeps a jet in the sky. He launched into it, a winding story about a mechanic no one could see, who crept onto planes in the dark and tightened every bolt while the pilots slept, who left a small mark on each engine so the planes would always know they were cared for. He acted it out in full, his voice dropping to a stage whisper at the good parts, his eyebrows rising at all the right moments. Within 3 minutes, Finn had stopped crying. Within 5, he was giggling, clutching Finnegan's hand, demanding to know if the ghost mechanic had ever fixed a really fast plane. "Son," Finnegan said, "I fixed the fastest." Greta was crying, but differently now, quietly. The way you cry when something you had stopped expecting suddenly appears right in front of you. "You didn't just calm him," she whispered. "You reminded me hope still exists." "You were already doing great," Finnegan said gently. "He just needed a story." She looked at him the way people rarely looked at him anymore, like he was actually there. "What's your name?" "Finnegan." Finn, mostly. The coincidence of it, her son's name, this stranger's name, landed on her face like a quiet surprise. She almost laughed. Almost. The flight attendant Denise had been watching from the back galley the entire time. 11 years of flying. She had seen passengers ignore crying children, step over spilled juice, roll their eyes at an exhausted mother. She had seen the full range of how people treat each other at 35,000 feet, and most of it was not worth remembering. This was different. She picked up the intercom handset and dialed the cockpit. "Captain, Denise at the rear galley, seat 12F. A single dad just calmed a terrified child with a toy wrench and a story. He called himself Ghost." A pause on the line. "Say that again," the captain said. "Did you say Ghost?" What the cockpit crew said to each other in the next 60 seconds. That's the part nobody on this plane was ready for. Denise came back down the aisle 2 minutes later. Her walk was different, careful, deliberate. The walk of a person carrying information they are not quite sure how to set down. She stopped at row 12 and looked at Finnegan the way you look at someone when you have just learned something about them that quietly rearranges everything. Like finding out the soft-spoken man at your church potluck spent 20 years as a surgeon. Or that your neighbor's husband once pulled 3 strangers from a burning car and never told a soul. "Sir," she said, voice low, "are you the Ghost? The crew chief who helped Captain Raphael about 10 years ago?" Finnegan blinked, like the question had to travel some distance before it arrived. "I just did what any decent person would," he said. "Helped a young pilot who was about to give up." Denise nodded slowly. She looked like a woman with more to say, unsure whether she was the right one to say it. She went back up the aisle. Lila tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, why did she look at you like that?" "I'm not sure, sweetheart." "Like Grandma looks at old photographs?" He looked down at her. "Yeah," he said quietly, "exactly like that." 2 rows up, Greta had gone very still. She was stroking Finn's hair on autopilot, her mind turning the word over and over like a stone in her palm. Ghost. Raphael had mentioned Ghost exactly once. Late one night, 2 years before everything fell apart. She had asked him who had shaped him most as a pilot. He'd gone quiet in the particular way he did when something mattered deeply, choosing words slowly, carefully, not wanting to bruise them. A crew chief, call sign Ghost. The night before my qualification run, I nearly walked away. Engine problem everyone said was unfixable. Everyone went home. Ghost stayed on the flight line alone until nearly 3 in the morning and fixed it. Found me before dawn, where I was sitting on the hangar floor, ready to quit, and said, "She's ready, and so are you." He had paused then, and added something Greta had almost forgotten until this exact moment. "I used to hope I'd run into him someday, just to say thank you. Some things you don't get to say in the moment, and then the moment is gone." She turned slowly in her seat. She looked at the worn denim jacket, the scuffed boots, the large, gentle hand resting over her son's small fist 2 rows back. because Finn had refused to let go, and Finnegan had simply let him hold on. "Oh," she thought. Just that one word. "Oh." The captain's voice filled the cabin. Not the practiced professional announcement voice. Something warmer, a little rougher at the edges. The voice of a man who had set aside his composure because this moment seemed to call for something more honest. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about a passenger in seat 12F. Heads lifted, phones lowered. The half-drowsing passenger in 14B opened his eyes. His name is Finnegan Brooks, call sign, Ghost, former United States Air Force crew chief. This morning, while the rest of us were focused on our own comfort, this man quietly left his seat, knelt down in the aisle, and calmed a terrified little boy, using nothing but a toy wrench and a story. The same steady hands and quiet character that once kept a young pilot from walking away from his career. A pause. The kind that means what comes next matters. 2 F-22 Raptors from a military training corridor to the north have requested permission to escort this aircraft for the next several minutes. One of those pilots is Captain Raphael. He says he owes Ghost a salute that is 10 years overdue. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the applause began. Hesitant at first, like the first drops of rain before a summer storm, then rolling backward through the cabin. Row by row, until it was everywhere, warm, full. The sound a room makes when everyone in it decides at the same moment to feel something true. Phones came up, not intrusively, just the instinct to hold on to something. Lila grabbed her father's hand with both of hers. "Daddy," she breathed. "Is that for you?" His jaw tightened, his throat moved, he took a slow breath. "I don't," he started. "You made everyone smile, Daddy." No question in her voice at all. Everyone on the whole plane. In 11D. The businessman had closed his laptop. His expression had shed the hard, impatient look it wore when he'd huffed over the carry-on delay. He looked older now, and somehow younger, like a man remembering something he had locked away and only just found the key to. He didn't speak yet, but the way he turned in his seat, slowly, fully, said everything. Greta stood up in the aisle. She hadn't planned to stand, she just found herself there. "Ghost," she said. Finnegan looked up at her. Her voice was careful, like she was carrying something fragile. "Raphael, my son's father. He talked about you as if you were the reason he didn't quit, the reason he became the man he is." "That was all him," Finnegan said. "No," she shook her head gently. "It was both of you. And today," she glanced at Finn, who was watching with enormous, wondering eyes. "Today you showed up for his son, too, without even knowing who he was." She sat back down before the tears arrived in earnest. Finn studied Finnegan with the solemn concentration of a child who has just added something very important to his permanent understanding of the world. "Are you a real ghost?" he asked. "No, buddy." "Are you a real hero?" Finnegan thought about 3 years of peanut butter sandwiches, about the pull-out sofa, about a little girl who handed over her most prized possession, without a second thought, to comfort a stranger's child. "I'm just a dad," he said. "That's enough." But somewhere outside this plane's windows, at supersonic speed, the answer to that question was already on its way. And it would arrive in a way that nobody in seat 12F saw coming. They came out of the sun. That is the detail people would remember later, when they told this story over dinner tables and phone calls, when they described it to a sister in Phoenix or a neighbor on the porch while the sprinklers ran. Not the applause, not the announcement, the jets. They came out of the sun, 2 F-22 Raptors, silver and precise as a thought, sliced into formation alongside the left side of the aircraft, close enough that you could see the cockpit glass catching the morning light, close enough that it felt less like a military maneuver and more like something you weren't supposed to witness, something private and enormous happening right outside the window. The cabin erupted. People pressed toward the left side windows, necks craning, breath fogging the ovals. Not in panic, in pure, stunned awe. The kind reserved for things that happen once and are never quite forgotten. Lila was on her knees in her seat, nose almost touching the glass. "Daddy, the fast planes!" "I see them, sweetheart." His voice was very quiet, and for one suspended moment. Finnegan Brooks, the man who had been invisible since the gate at Dallas, who had been invisible for 3 long years, who had been invisible even to himself in the hollow months after the funeral, felt completely, undeniably seen. The lead pilot lifted one gloved hand, not a casual wave, a salute, slow, deliberate, the kind that carries full weight behind it. That isn't ceremony or performance, the kind that simply says without words, "I see you, I remember, I owe you more than this can hold." Then the voice came through the cabin speakers. The captain had left the channel open, a quiet, deliberate gift to everyone aboard. "Ghost, this is Eagle 1. Controlled, steady, a pilot's voice. But underneath the control, just barely audible to anyone paying real attention. Something raw and exposed. 10 years ago, you stayed on a runway when everyone else had gone home. Engine fault that everyone called terminal. You worked alone until nearly 3 in the morning. You fixed my jet, and before dawn, you came and found me sitting on the hangar floor, and you said, 'She's ready, and so are you.' A pause that seemed to last longer than it did. I never got to thank you. The cabin held its breath. This morning, my son needed someone. I was in the air. I couldn't be there, and you showed up, the same way you always did, without being asked, without expecting a thing, with nothing but a kind word and a story." His voice broke, once, slightly, the way a well-built thing cracks when the pressure is finally more than it was designed to hold. "Ghost, the entire squadron heard what happened on this flight. We would like to escort you the rest of the way home." One more beat, softer, almost private, as if he had forgotten for a moment that the whole plane was listening. "I hope life has treated you well. You deserve that, you always did." The second jet banked slightly closer. That pilot turned toward the window of row 12, turned fully and deliberately, and held a salute. The second jet banked slightly closer. That pilot turned toward the window of row 12, turned fully and deliberately, and held a salute. Steady, unhurried, the kind that asks nothing back and means everything. Lila turned from the window to her father. "Daddy?" Her voice had gone very soft. "They're waving at you." He pulled her close. She felt his chest expand, not with words, but with the kind of breath that comes when something you have kept locked down for a very long time finally breaks through. "Yeah, Bug," he said. "They are." That was when Colonel Lauren stood up. She had been in seat 9C, a trim woman in a gray cardigan and sensible shoes. A novel open in her lap that she hadn't read a single word of since Dallas. 34 years old, United States Air Force. On this flight for entirely ordinary reasons until approximately 5 minutes ago. She could have stayed in her seat. She could have stayed quiet, stayed invisible. The way Finnegan had been invisible all morning. She didn't. She walked to row 12, turned to face Finnegan Brooks, and saluted him. Clean, crisp, not a performance, just truth, delivered formally. "Sir, my name is Colonel Lauren Hayes, 16 years of service. In that time, I have met 3 people who led entirely by example. No rank, no recognition, nothing to gain." She held his gaze without wavering. "You are the third. Your kindness traveled at supersonic speed today. The whole squadron knows your name." She held the salute one long beat past what protocol required. Then she lowered her hand, returned to 9C, and sat very straight, blinking more than usual, the way composed people do when they are quietly, genuinely moved, and committed to not showing all of it. The businessman in 11D stood up. He turned fully, extended his hand over the seat back. "I huffed at you over a carry-on bag," he said. His voice carried the roughness of a man unaccustomed to admitting things out loud. "My name is David. I've behaved poorly on this entire flight, and I'd like to shake your hand if you'll allow it." Finnegan looked at the hand, then he shook it. "Nothing to forgive, David." David sat back down. He did not reopen his laptop. He reached instead into his briefcase, produced a business card, and held it over the seat. "I don't know what you need," he said, "but if you ever need a reference or a contact, you call that number. Consider it the least I can do." Finnegan took the card, tucked it into his breast pocket beside the folded page he didn't know yet was waiting for him. From row 10. Greta watched it all, the jets, the salute, the colonel, David's outstretched hand, with Finn settled in her lap, his stuffed elephant tucked under his chin, eyes heavy and wondering. He had watched everything, filed it all away in the particular permanent way children file things that matter. "When I grow up," he announced, to no one in particular, "I want to be a ghost." The row dissolved into soft, surprised laughter, the kind that doesn't diminish a moment, but deepens it, makes it real, makes it human. Lila patted his hand with the authority of a 7-year-old who has considered the matter carefully. "It's okay," she told him. "I'll show you how." Outside the windows, the two jets held their formation, steady, silver, brilliant in the morning sun. Not ahead of the plane, beside it, escorting it home. What was inside the sealed envelope Colonel Lauren had been quietly carrying in her bag since the gate at Dallas? The one nobody on this plane knew existed yet, was about to change everything Finnegan had spent 3 years quietly resigning himself to. The envelope was cream-colored, official, sealed with the kind of deliberate care that says, "This matters." Colonel Lauren had been carrying it in the outer pocket of her canvas bag since the gate at Dallas. Instructions from the base commander to hand-deliver it in Seattle, quietly. No fanfare. She had expected to do it at baggage claim. She had not expected any of this. She retrieved it now, walked back to row 12, and held it out. "Mr. Brooks, this was addressed to you. The base commander asked me to deliver it personally in Seattle." A small pause. "I had no idea, until about 10 minutes ago, that you were on this plane." Finnegan took the envelope. His name was typed on the front. Finnegan Brooks, call sign, Ghost. No return address. He looked up at her. "Open it," she said quietly. Lila watched her father's face the way she always watched it, reading him the way only children who have learned to pay very close attention can read a parent, looking for the information he would never say out loud. She saw his hands go still. She saw his jaw tighten. She saw his eyes move across the page. Once, then again. Slower, as if the words needed a moment to become real. "Daddy?" He didn't answer right away. When he looked up, his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the window light. "It's a job offer, Bug," he said. "What kind?" He cleared his throat. "Full-time civilian mechanic, McCord Air Base, benefits, housing assistance on base." His voice was steady but thin at the edges, like paper held up to strong light. "And a full scholarship, for your education, all the way through." Lila processed this the way she processed most important things, with a small, serious nod. Then she wrapped both arms around his arm and pressed her cheek against his sleeve. "So we're gonna be okay," she said. Not a question. "Yeah." He pressed his lips to her hair. "We really are." Colonel Lauren nodded toward the back of the letter. "There's a handwritten note from the base commander." He turned the page over. 4 lines, written in the kind of deliberate pen that means the writer took their time. Ghost. "Raphael told me your story the same night he earned his wings. I told him then, if I ever find that man, I'm hiring him. I always keep my word." Finnegan read it once, then again. Then he folded it carefully along its original crease and placed it in the breast pocket of his jacket, over his heart, though he probably didn't realize that was where he'd put it. He sat for a moment with his hands on his knees, not moving, just breathing. The way you breathe when something too large to name has just settled inside your chest and you need a few seconds to be sure it's real. Lila rested her head on his arm and waited, with the unhurried patience of a child who understands that some silences are not empty. David. The businessman in 11D had been turned around in his seat for the better part of 10 minutes now, watching, thinking, looking like a man who had spent the flight slowly remembering something he'd been too busy to practice. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it properly." He looked directly at Finnegan. "I made a full judgment about you before you'd said a word. Your jacket, your boots, 2 extra seconds at the overhead bin. I built an entire story about who you were, and every bit of it was wrong." Finnegan was quiet. "I interview people for my company every week," David continued, "and I think I've been doing it the same way I boarded this plane, deciding before I've really looked." He exhaled. "I don't want to keep doing that." "You stood up," Finnegan said. "You said so. That's the hard part." David looked at him with an expression caught somewhere between gratitude and discomfort. The look of a man not accustomed to being given grace he hasn't earned yet. "How do you do that?" he asked. "Make a person feel better about themselves after they've treated you badly?" Finnegan was quiet for a moment. "I had a good teacher," he said. Lila looked up at him. "Who?" "Your mom," he said simply. David glanced between them. The man and the girl. The worn jacket. The pink backpack. The easy, undefended way they looked at each other. Then he held out his business card over the seat back. "If you ever need anything, a contact, a reference, anything at all, that's my direct line. I mean it." Finnegan took the card and tucked it in beside the letter. 2 things over his heart now, both of them unexpected. Both of them, in their own way, a kind of arrival. Outside, the 2 Raptors were beginning their departure arc, banking slowly north, wings tilting in a long rolling salute before they climbed back into the open sky and disappeared. The wing rock, the goodbye that pilots use when no words will carry the distance. The cabin watched without reaching for their phones. Some moments are not for recording. Some moments you simply hold. Greta, in row 10, had Finn asleep against her shoulder now, his hand still loosely curled where Finnegan's had been. His little fingers not quite registering that the man had let go. She watched the jets until there was nothing left of them but blue. She thought about 4 months of distance, about doing everything alone and then waking up and doing it again, about the phone calls across time zones, about a man who had stayed on a runway in the dark for no reason except that it was the right thing to do. If people like that still exist, she thought, then the rest of it is survivable. The plane began to descend. That soft pressure in the ears, the shift in cabin light as the clouds thinned below them, and Washington State emerged. Green and silver and genuinely new. Lila had taken out the blue crayon, reserved always for important things, and was drawing in the margin of her horsebook. Finnegan leaned over to look. 2 jets, and underneath them, very small but very careful, a man and a little girl, holding hands. "That's us," she said. "I know." He gently tore the page from the margin, folded it once, and placed it in his breast pocket, beside the letter and the business card. 3 things, now, carried over his heart: a job offer, a stranger's gesture of decency, and a crayon drawing made by a 7-year-old who had never once stopped believing her father was worth celebrating. What he would do that night. After the landing, after the baggage carousel, after his sister's porch with the screen door that always stuck, was the part nobody expected, not even him. His sister's house smelled like pot roast and pine sol and the particular warmth of a home where someone has been waiting for you for a long time. Carol Brooks was 51, with a laugh that came from somewhere below the diaphragm, and a hug that lasted until she decided it was done, which was never as quickly as you expected. She was standing on the porch when the cab pulled up, still in her work apron, the screen door propped open with 1 foot, and when she saw Lila tumble out of the back seat with that pink backpack bouncing, Carol made a sound that was not quite laughing and not quite crying, but was fully and completely both. "There she is," Carol said into Lila's curls. "There's my girl." Finnegan carried the bags up the 3 porch steps. Carol looked at him over the top of Lila's head, the long, level look of an older sister who has known every version of her brother's face since he was 7 years old, and reads him the way she reads the sky before a storm. "You look different," she said. "Good different or bad different?" She tilted her head. "Like something let go," she said. He didn't argue. Dinner was warm and loud and exactly what it needed to be. The pot roast had been started the night before. Carol's particular way of saying, "I've been thinking about this day for a while." The bread was slightly hard on one end because she'd been watching for the cab instead of the timer. The gravy was perfect. The conversation moved the way it does with family that doesn't need to perform for each other. Overlapping, unfinished, comfortable. Lila told the whole story at full volume and maximum gesture. Knocking over a glass of water at the part about the F-22s, Carol mopped it up without interrupting, because she understood without being told that this was not a moment for interruptions. When Lila finally wound down, breathless, cheeks flushed, enormously pleased with herself, Carol set down her fork and looked across the table at her brother. "Ghost," she said. He shrugged. "Old nickname." She was quiet for a moment, the deliberate kind of quiet she got when she had been thinking something for a long time and was finally ready to say it. "You've been telling yourself you're invisible," she said. "For 3 years, maybe longer." She shook her head. "You were never invisible, Finn. People just weren't paying attention. There's a difference, and you need to know that." He looked at her across the pot roast and the tipped water glass and the general happy wreckage of the table. He didn't answer, but he heard her. Bedtime took 4 stories, 2 glasses of water, 1 urgent report about the closet being too dark and too quiet at the same time, and a 15-minute negotiation about whether Gerald could sleep in the bed. Gerald could, obviously. When Lila was finally asleep, the deep, uncomplicated sleep of a child who has had a very large day and is certain the world is good. Finnegan stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her breathe. He thought about the empty seat on the plane, not with the sharp grief of the early years, with the slower, quieter ache of someone who has lived with a loss long enough that it has become part of who they are. The way a healed bone is slightly thicker at the break, present, changed, still standing. She would have loved today, he thought. She would have laughed at Gerald. She would have cried at the salute. Not from sadness, but from that particular joy she had always carried for the world's surprising goodness. She would have reached over on the plane and squeezed his hand without saying a word. That had always been enough. He turned off the lamp, pulled the door to. He went to the window in Carol's living room, the west-facing one. The kind your grandmother might have stood at for exactly this reason. Catching the last of the evening light before the dark came in, he stood there, looking out at the sky. Stars, more than Dallas ever showed. The air was cleaner here, the dark deeper, and if you gave your eyes a moment, they could find the real sky, the one that goes all the way back. He had not cried since the funeral, not once. Not when the pipes burst in January and the floor warped and he couldn't afford the repair. Not when Lila's teacher called to say she was struggling to make friends. Not on the anniversary, or at Christmas. Or on that one birthday when he'd sat alone at the kitchen table at midnight with a cupcake and a candle and nothing left to say. He had held it, because there was no one to hold him while he did. What changed tonight? He couldn't have said precisely. Maybe it was the salute. Maybe it was the letter. Maybe it was Lila's voice, so calm, so certain, saying the fast planes waved at us because you were kind, Daddy. The way she said all true things, as if kindness were simply a law of the universe, as obvious and reliable as gravity. Or maybe it was Carol's voice at dinner, "You were never invisible," said plainly, meaning it. He stood at that window and let the tears come, quietly, without drama. The way rain arrives when the air has finally held enough. He let it happen, and then, slowly, it passed. What remained was something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Not happiness exactly, something underneath happiness, the ground floor, the foundation. The quiet, solid knowing that the ground was there, that it would hold, that the next step was possible, and the one after that, and the one after that. He was still a single dad. Still had boots worn through at the toe, still carried a loss that would never fully leave. Still had a daughter who feared flying, kept a toy wrench in her backpack, and fell asleep to horse stories. But somewhere above this house, right now, this very moment, pilots were moving through a dark sky faster than sound, and they knew his name, and they had come. The next morning, Lila found him at Carol's kitchen table. The old percolator was going. The letter from McCord was spread open in front of him, next to David's business card and the folded crayon drawing, pressed flat by his palm. She climbed into the chair beside him and reviewed it all with great seriousness, the way she reviewed most important things. "So we're staying?" "We're staying. Can I go to a school with a good art room?" "I'll make sure of it." She nodded, the crisp, final nod of a person closing a deal. Then she reached into her backpack, still in her arms, always in her arms, and set Gerald the toy wrench in the center of the letter. "For good luck," she said. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he left it right where she'd put it. This story teaches us one quiet truth. The people the world overlooks are often the ones holding it together. Finnegan never asked to be seen. He just kept showing up. For his daughter, for a stranger's frightened child, for the right thing, with no audience and no guarantee of return. Here is what that looks like in a real life. On an ordinary Tuesday, the next time you're standing in a grocery line and the cashier looks exhausted, put down your phone, look her in the eye, and say, "You're doing a great job today." Mean it. That's all. That small moment costs you 11 seconds, and may be the only kind word she hears all week. Kindness given quietly, with no expectation, no audience, no score kept, has a way of finding its way back. Not always loudly, not always quickly, but it always comes back. Crafted by a human, accompanied by AI. This piece hopes to leave you with one feeling, that kindness is like tiny seeds, sometimes buried under dry, cracked soil, but with just a little patience and faith, they will sprout and paint an entire sky with color.